So welcome everyone to the group. Um, we just finished Genesis and Exodus. Wow. 1 week to finish those two big books. A lot of territory. So I'm not going to cover everything. I've sent you a couple of videos that kind of summarize both books. I'll be doing that through most of these next 3 months. So if you want a summary, and there's good outlines on the internet, and occasionally I'll put one up too. But anyway, I'm just going to answer some questions that some of you have sent to me or told me about. And so the first one has to do with in Genesis, why was Abel's sacrifice accepted and not Cain's? And if you remember, Cain was pretty angry about that, and it ended up murdering his brother Abel. Well, some pastors say that it has to do with attitude, and that God sees the heart, and maybe Cain's was not the best kind of attitude. There is a verse in Hebrew that we'll get to eventually that talks about Abel's sacrifice was by faith. And some people say he just had more faith. But I tend to think it's something a little more than that. Did you notice that Abel, who took care of the flock, brought the firstborn, and it was a blood sacrifice? Later on, it's really spelled out in, I think it's Leviticus, where that is what God demands if it's for sin. And so maybe this was a sin sacrifice, and Abel went about it the right way. Cain did not. Well, you might say, well, but how did they know? There wasn't the Mosaic law yet. Well, I think that it's quite possible that God told them. It wasn't written down at that point, but I think he told them. And if you remember when Adam and Eve first sinned, there were animals that were killed after they sinned, because there was God used their skin to make clothes for Adam and Eve. Also, Noah did a blood sacrifice. Abraham did a blood sacrifice. He was going to offer his son Isaac, but God did provide a ram. Isaac was willing to be the blood sacrifice. Jacob built an altar and made sacrifices, probably blood sacrifices. And even Job sacrificed for his children's sins. And Job, a lot of people say, is the oldest book in the Bible. So here's an interesting thought too. The Hebrew slaves must have been doing, or were used to doing, blood sacrifices because they wanted to take their animals with them, and the Egyptians didn't want to let them take their animals with them because they were going to do blood sacrifice. So all of that was before the Mosaic law was written in Leviticus and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. So I think they knew, and I think that's why God did not accept it. That's amazing when you think of it, that it goes way back to Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And of course, all of these blood sacrifices were looking forward to Jesus and his sacrifice, just like we look back to Jesus and his sacrifice. It didn't really take away their sin at that point, because only Jesus' death could take away their sin, but it was the faith looking forward to that. It was kind of a pictogram or whatever to get the point across to the people. It also showed how serious sin was, that something had to die, something innocent had to die. Okay, so that was question number one. Question number two. This comes from Genesis 6:3, and let me read it for you. This It's just before the flood. And it says, Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. So the question is God saying that man will only live to be 120 years, and he can't live longer than that? Or is it something else that he's saying? Well, if you look at the years that people lived before the flood, they were living really long, like 900 years. Most of them around 900 or more. The one exception was Enoch, who probably didn't die but was raptured. First rapture case. And then if you look at after the flood, well, Noah died after the flood, and he was 950, but he was 600 years old when the flood started. And Shem, his son, lived to be 600. And there's other ages, but it seems like the farther you go along, it gets less and less. David actually lived. Well, let's look at Abraham first. He was 175. Isaac was 180. David lived only to be 70. So as time went on, people were dying younger. I mean, there was like I think about 1,300 to 1,400 years from the creation to the flood. And during that time, people lived really long. And then after it, there was kind of a sudden drop. So some people have thought the environment caused it, and God did mean that man would only live 120 years, and but it was going to be a gradual thing. The other thought is that what he meant by that was when he gave that word to Noah, there was 120 years left before the flood started, which would mean the verses would be a little out of chronological order if you look at them. But, and meaning that he was going to wipe out, he was only going to give them 120 years, except for the 8 that he saved, to experience God as humans. I personally think he's talking about the age of man, and that it wasn't going to be overnight that it changed. It did change a lot, but it took a while to get down to 120. And you know, you look at people today, and there's hardly anybody that lives over 120 years old. It's very unusual. And yes, there were some exceptions back then, but maybe God, you know, there were exceptions with, there were exceptions with Abraham and Sara, and they had a child when they were really old. And so he can make exceptions, and some of those he maybe wanted them to live longer. But generally, people don't live to be more than 120 years old. So I think that's what it's saying. What do you think? Let me know if you have some thoughts on it. Okay, question number 3. This has to do with a couple of chapters. One is chapter 12 in Genesis, where Abram takes Sara and goes to Egypt. And then chapter 20, when Abraham, his name has changed now, Abraham takes Sara and goes to the Negev. And in both cases, Abraham, let's just call him Abraham, asks his wife Sara to say that she is his sister, because he's afraid that, in the first case in Egypt, he was afraid that Pharaoh would, because she was so beautiful, that Pharaoh would kill him because he would want to marry her. Um, and in the second case, he asks the same thing. Okay, so why did Abraham lie about that? Well, he lied about it because, and actually it was a half lie. He lied about it because he didn't have enough faith in God at that point. You know, he's known for his faith. Abraham is known for his faith, but he wasn't perfect. So that's why he lied. But she really was his sister, his half-sister. And he explains that in chapter 20 when Abimelech finds out that she is also Abraham's wife. And there is the possibility, okay, so then, yeah, people will say, well, how come he was marrying his sister? Well, she was a half-sister, but there is a possibility she was actually a cousin because of the way that they say, they talk about their fathers. Sometimes it's their father's father. So she might not have been an actual half-sister. She was related in some way, let's put it that way. Also, you got to remember, Leviticus wasn't written yet, and maybe there wasn't the law about not marrying your sister, your half-sister at that point. Remember when Adam and Eve had children, they didn't have anybody else to marry, so they had to marry each other to get the human race started. And, the gene pool was so pure at that point that it didn't hurt anything that much. But nowadays, there's enough possibility of bad genes coming to the forefront when you marry or you have a child with your brother or your sister. So it's outlawed. So that's the thought on that. Oh, and one more thing. There is like the thought, well, how come they wanted her? The first time in the Negev, in Egypt, she was 65 years old. Well, I'm 70. At 65, I wasn't that bad looking, I think. So, it's possible she was very beautiful still. And of course, the second time with Abimelech, she is 90. But, the thing is, when she was maybe just barely pregnant at that point. Because maybe at the moment that the angels told her she was going to have a baby the next year, which was Isaac, she had to start, her menstruation again. All those hormones came back into her body again. So she probably became more youthful, and it was very miraculous. So she might have, described herself as all withered up, and that she could have been talking about her womb or something at that point. And it sounded like she wasn't enjoying a sexual relationship at that point when they said that she was going to have a baby. But again, she'd gone through the change. Maybe her hormones weren't up. But I think after God, created that miracle for her, things changed and she became more beautiful again. So that's my thought on that. How about you? The next question is found in Genesis 19, and it has to do with the two angels coming to Sodom and going to Lot's house. And the people in the town are all the men in the town come and want to rape the two men. And Lot offers up his two virgin daughters. So the question was, how could Lot do that? You know, how could he be a righteous man and do that? Well, first of all, you got to think about the culture at the time, and the way women were treated wasn't right, but that's the way it was. Um, and it's possible that Lot knew they were angels, and he was a little afraid of what would happen to him if he didn't take care of the angels and protect them. Or also, you know, hospitality was a big deal then, still is, but a really big deal back then. And those men or angels, you know, had come to his house, come to the town, and he wanted to protect them. And besides that, Lot was not sinless. Okay, first of all, he chose to live in Sodom. He picked the best land, gave Abraham the other land in the hillside, the rocky hillside. And he wanted to live in that big city, which he knew was sinful. And he became, a judge or something in that city. He was sitting at the gate, which was what they would do when they had an official position there. And then he also later on sleeps with his daughters in the cave, right? And yes, he was drunk, but he might have kind of known what he was doing, and maybe he wanted his line to go on just like they did. Who knows? But anyway, that's, I guess the thing that we should think of too is that the angels did protect the two girls. They struck blindness on all the men there. They pulled them back in time. So that was good. You know, one thing I really like about the Bible is it shows the weaknesses and the sins of the main characters and not just their strengths. And some of those are actual ancestors to Jesus. They're in that line, which is just, you know, makes it more believable to me. If they were making up the story, I don't think they would include them. So those are the questions on Genesis that I had. Not that I had, but someone asked me, so I thought I would share those with you.